So, camera's off and rolling, and first of all, an apology for all the people who are our normal YouTube watchers. Last week's video is still in recovery mode. It means that the laptop battery died and it didn't save it correctly. The file got corrupted. So I'm still trying to get the video out because it recorded about 90% of the class and the battery died just before the end, but that means it's having trouble getting the file to get that final piece, the final bits of the file itself to make the computer be able to read it as a video file so I can then upload it.
But you had something else done too.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's right. I've also begun a collaborative process with another YouTube channel called Jason's Spiritual Babies. He's a gentleman in Ireland, and we're going to be doing classes on the Haftarah. So those are going to be half-hour segments. It's a half-hour Haftarah. That was his title. Very good. And we just did an introductory one, and then we're going to be recording videos beginning with Bereshit, beginning with the first parasha, and going forward for the new year. So stay tuned for that. You can either search for it, or if you go to my channel, you can find a link to the Haftarah channel and watch the introduction if you've missed it. But for now, we're back in Torah land, and that means we need to study. We are now in Parashat Teitzei, exactly. And as I've mentioned from the Bima, Deuteronomy gets a lot of mitzvahs in a lot of the Parshiot, because Deuteronomy is partially a retelling of many of the commandments that had been given to the Israelites through Moses in earlier stages, and now Moses is trying to sort of reiterate them, sometimes emphasize, sometimes clarify, depending upon how you want to look at it. It means that you get a lot of mitzvahs per page, and that creates for some very interesting study. It also creates for a lot of headaches for trying to decide which mitzvahs to pick to have as part of our discussion. But I hope that you'll agree that the mitzvot that we're going to be looking at today are worth studying, and if not, tell me later. All right, so let's go ahead and get underway. We are on page 1115, which is chapter 22 of Devarim, chapter 22 in the book of Deuteronomy. And I need a reader. Marian, thank you.
If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If your fellow does not live near you, or you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. You shall do the same with his ass, you shall do the same with his garment, and so too shall you do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent.
Okay. A couple short sentences. What's it talking about?
Finding something that doesn't belong to you.
Returning belongings. It's not finders keepers.
It's not finders keepers. I'm returning lost property. So there are actually two mitzvot here that are being discussed. There's a positive one and there's a negative one. Remember, in Torah terminology, a positive commandment are the thou shalts, to borrow King James language, and the negative commandments are thou shalt not. So what are our two commandments?
You shall return
Okay.
things.
You shall not steal.
Okay, so
It's not stealing, it's keeping.
there's returning something that belongs to someone else, right? So that if you find, this wallet, you have to return it. You can't just set it on your shelf. You have to try and find the owner. You have to return it, and
Not keeping.
not being indifferent, right? Don't ignore. And I want to make sure that before we begin discussing this in detail, that we understand these two different distinctions, right? These two different commandments. Returning it means once you have taken hold of it, once it comes into your possession, you don't get to keep it. You have to return it to the rightful owner. And we're going to talk about all those kinds of details in just a few minutes. That's a very important positive commandment. Don't ignore means that if you see something that is lost, you don't get to choose whether or not you're going to take it into your possession and try and return it to the proper owner. If you see a wallet on the street, you don't get to say, it's too much bother, and keep walking. You have to try to return it to the proper owner. And that's a very important consideration. Because most of us would agree with this, right? That it's not finders keepers, right? As you pointed out, it's not just, oh, well, look, I found a new bike, so I get to keep it. Yay! You go, okay, I found a bike. It belongs to someone. I have to try and find the owner. Okay. But many of us are more prone to violating this particular commandment, which is, oh, look, there's somebody's bike just dumped there on the side of the road. Who could that belong to? I mean, it's just not anywhere near anyone's house. And keep going. And that would be violating that mitzvah.
I was watching some of the programs that I had recorded while I was gone, and there was one, Rizzoli and Isles, and it involved a man who might have found some lost drug money. And the comment was, there is no law in Boston that says you have to return money that you found.
Interesting.
And I thought, in context with this, that's an interesting comment on our society now.
That you would not have to return
There's no
money
law
that you find.
says you have to return money that you find if there's no identification.
If there's no identification.
Right.
Would the quantity of money be an identification? Would the way the money was wrapped or stored?
Depending on how you look at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at that particular
Right.
point, because the command to return plus the command not to ignore is creating a massive duty. Right? If I have to return anything that comes into my possession that's not mine, that was lost, and I don't even have the choice of whether to ignore it, then aren't I going to end up spending my entire life playing lost and found duty? And you're like, well, look, there's some lint here. This must have come from someone else's trousers. I better find them and return it to them.
Value.
What's that?
It has to be of some value.
Did the Torah say that?
No.
So you're
I'm
you're
guessing-
deciding by
I'm
yourself.
guessing the Mishnah says it.
You're guessing the Mishnah says it. Well, you're in luck. You're not going to have to guess what the Mishnah says, because we're going to look at the Mishnah. But this is one of the reasons why the Mishnah, that first compilation of the rabbinic explanations of how we implement Torah in a living community, is so important. Because if we begin from the principle, as we should, that we are bound by Torah, that we are commanded by God to fulfill the commandments, that's kind of what commanding means, then if we misunderstand this, we will either be ignoring our duties and failing to fulfill the commandments, which is bad, or we will over compel ourselves to fulfill in ways that are not being commanded of us, that are not required of us. And in the case of lost and found, it's very easy to see that you would be out constantly spending your entire life trying to return everything you came across whose owner wasn't immediately apparent. And I'll give you the spoiler alert, that's not the conclusion we're going to reach.
Is returning something to another person good enough? If you find a wallet, is it good enough to return it to the head of security in the building you're in, or to the police, or something like that?
So the short answer is, if there is an officially appointed agent that is in charge of tracking down and returning lost property, or that others will use to go to find their lost property, for example, a lost and found at a school or something like that, then yes, you have discharged your duty by handing it over to that agreed upon representative. But just giving it to someone else, or saying the guy behind me can pick it up and deal with it, is not allowed. But this basic principle that Torah creates an obligation, Torah creates a commandment, but then also limits the commandment, is a pattern we see over and over again. Right? Torah creates obligation. It's our covenant. Entering into the covenant with God means that we have obligations that we wouldn't have had if we hadn't been given Torah. But it is also from within Torah that we find the limits to those obligations, which could be infinite if we weren't careful. And Torah does not expect us to act infinitely, because we're finite creatures. Okay, but we don't get to just decide on our own what we're going to do or not do. For example, I'm just going to step over the wallet and pretend like I don't see it. We don't get that option. So we need to find out what limits there are from within our tradition. Make sense? Good. One more little example, big example, but a short sentence that exemplifies this as well. Marion, you were reading the next verse, verse 4.
If you see your fellow's ass or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. You must help him raise it.
Okay. One sentence,
Yeah.
right? What's it mean?
You need to
We
help
have to
someone
help.
if they need.
You need to help someone if they need it?
Yeah.
Well, can't they call like AAA? You know, the American Ass Association?
They may not have a cell phone with them.
They may not have a cell phone with them. Right? Or certainly in the ancient world. What, you didn't know that? There was a donkey tow truck? If your donkey gets a flat, what are you going to do?
I can see the donkey coming, another donkey coming, a bigger one.
A donkey on the back of another donkey.
Flatbed.
A flatbed donkey. A flat back donkey. Right, so, but this is saying again, you have to not ignore. Right? If you see it, you have to help. It's not if you see it, decide if you have time to help, decide if you want to help. It's if you see the need, you have to do it. You have to do it, and you can't ignore. It's creating an obligation, but doesn't that mean then we'd be stuck lifting donkeys our whole life? You know, stopping every 5 feet? And what happens if the person isn't even nice to us when we come to help them?
Which happens quite often sometimes.
Which, when we try to help, sometimes does happen, right? Well, thankfully, our sages got your back. That is to say, we have answers and discussions of answers for these topics. We're going to start off looking through. There we go. Through some Mishnah.
Right away.
Now, just a quick restatement of what the Mishnah is. The Torah is the received written word that we have as our revelation from God. The Mishnah is the oral transmission of the explanation of how this went. And as our sages themselves describe, the Mishnah was not dictated verbatim. That is to say, it isn't a perfect verbal text that everybody had memorized up to the point where it was finally written down by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in around the year 250 CE, but that instead it was an oral set of explanation. And just like different teachers might explain how to do arithmetic differently or differently to different students, one of them might use those little boxes and cube things, and another one might use fingers and counting tools, and another one might just go straight to the numbers. The end result is still doing math right, even if different teachers might have had different ways of doing it, of explaining it to the students. The Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote down, the Mishnah that we have, this formal written version, is what was felt to be at his time the best, most succinct, and most easily memorizable version of that set of instructions and teachings that help us understand how to actually fulfill Torah. Did I lose everyone there? That makes sense? All right, so the Mishnah is like the teacher's notes that goes along with the student text, meaning the Torah. So everyone's got a copy of the Torah, and then the teacher tells you how to understand it based upon the teacher's notes. And that's the Mishnah. Because the students, that is to say every single Jewish person in the world throughout all of history and time, are going to come up with a lot of questions on this particular topic, for example, of, wait a minute, when do I and when don't I? Do I have to pick up the lint and return it? What about if I find a penny? These kinds of questions are going to come up over and over again through the generations, and the teachers need to be able to help people navigate correctly the answers to how to interpret these few little verses so that we are following Torah and not just making it up as we go.
Does the Mishnah offer that different direction?
You mean is there debate?
Yes.
Yes,
That's what-
and there is also a resolution. So that is to say that minority opinions are included in the Mishnah, but the majority opinion is the opinion that stands. And sometimes you need a lot more discussion, debate, and elucidation of when you only have minority opinions of knowing which one was the right one.
So when they
And that's where the Talmud comes in.
Rashi said this, but someone else said something different.
Exactly, although Rashi was 1,000 years later, but you might have like Rabbi Akiva said this and Rabbi Meir said this.
So how is the decision, final decision?
There is a built-in set of hermeneutical tools. That's one of those great party words that lets you analyze a Mishnah to see whether it's a majority versus a minority, whether it's this rabbi versus that rabbi, and who wins in the different cases. So there's actually a little table that you can use that will give you a way to analyze it if the Mishnah itself doesn't make it 100% explicit.
What is that word again?
The hermeneutical? Hermeneutical. Yeah. It's a great term,
Wonderful.
isn't it? Yeah.
Works in Scrabble.
Is it a
Oh, it
real
never
word?
works in Scrabble. You never get all the letters. Is it a real word?
Yeah.
Are you accusing me of making words up?
We do it all the time.
Yes, it's a real word.
What
It's
is
a real
it in
word.
one sentence?
It's
Well,
called what?
let's get on with it.
Should I continue?
Okay, so we're on the handout now, and we're going to start with the shortest analysis first, which is the helping out with the donkey. Because as we're going to see, it's a little bit more complicated when dealing with the lost and found. Because most of us, if we find something nice, we want to keep it. Right? Wouldn't we want to, if we find a diamond ring,
You find it before it got lost?
if you find it before it got lost, yes, what we call stealing. It was bound to be lost eventually, so I just took it before it got lost and no one could get it. Yes, and actually our sages do discuss that kind of reasoning, but that's a much more complicated topic because there is a great deal more incentive to manipulate the interpretation to be very self-serving when it comes to lost and found. Whereas when it comes to the donkey, there's a very simple reason why you would not, that you try to justify to yourself, which is, I don't want to. It's work, it's effort. And if I can avoid doing it, then I probably will. And that's why they're going to try and explain how to limit and guide that sense of duty. Marion now.
If he unloaded the ass fallen under its load and reloaded it and again unloaded it and reloaded it, even 4 or 5 times, he is still obligated, for it is written, you must surely raise it with him.
All right, so it is a surely raise. It's the wonderful infinitive construct form that gives intensity to this verse. And therefore, if you help him load the donkey and the donkey takes 2 steps and goes, gah, you unload it, reload it, the donkey gets up, takes 2 steps, gah. You don't get to say, man, I helped you once, my mitzvah's done, I'm out of here. You say, well, no, the mitzvah is, I will surely do this. That means I've got to do it again and again and again. Unless,
If the owner went and sat down and said, since the commandment is upon you, if you wish to unload, unload. He is not obligated, for it is written with him.
right, since that wonderful word imo, with him, is there in our verse, if the owner says, hey, look, here comes a sucker. Yeah, my donkey just fell under its load, and I know that's a mitzvah for you to fix, so I'm going to go sit under this tree, and you let me know when the donkey's ready. Right? Because you got this duty to do the mitzvah of helping, reload the donkey. And this guy's going to exploit you for doing that mitzvah. But no, because it says, with him. Because the verse has that phrase, with him, our sages explain very clearly, he has to help you with the loading and unloading. The Torah is not asking you to go around loading and unloading everyone's donkey for them. It's saying you unload and load everyone's donkey with them. You don't become a slave, you become a helper. And that's an important limit to having this duty become a full-time profession.
But if the owner was aged or sick, he is obligated.
But the sages say, but there's a small limitation to that, which is if the guy who has the donkey that has collapsed under the load is too old to help you or too sick to be able to help you, then you don't rely on the with him part, the emo, but instead say, I'm sure he would help me if he could, but since he can't, the mitzvah's still on me. What's that? The mitzvah. The mitzvah of helping reload that donkey. So, good example, hopefully, of the way our sages try to analyze the verse and analyze the situation and continue to pass on the wisdom of how to understand and implement what is a single sentence with enough push, keep doing it, and enough limits, but you don't have to do it for him, and with a little bit of a compassion, but if they couldn't do it, then yes, you would do it for them. And we end up with a fuller sense of how to perform this mitzvah. And by the way, there is a little bit more in the Mishnah, which I didn't include, which talks about if the burden for the donkey is too great and there's no way that donkey is going to be able to carry it, you don't have to keep doing it and it goes 3 steps and it goes 3 steps and it goes 3 steps. If it's donkey stubbornness, then yes, you do have to help. But if it's the guy is putting, a Buick on the back of the donkey, you don't have to keep putting the Buick back with it. And in fact, you're not allowed to because it would be causing harm to the animal. Make sense?
Yes.
All right, so now that we got the simple version down, let's get to the complicated stuff. Lost and found.
Which found objects belong to the finder, and which ones must be proclaimed in the lost and found?
All right, so first of all, we already just discovered from the Mishnah, you get to keep some things. Not everything that is lost, that is found, must be returned. Dun, dun, dun. And we're going to have to try and figure out from our analysis of the Mishnah of why some things fall into the category of must be returned and why some things don't. So keep that in the side of your mind as we go through this. Onward. The A.
Yeah, these found objects belong to the finder.
Right, this is what you get to keep.
If a man found scattered fruit, scattered money, small sheaves in the public domain, cakes of figs, baker's loaves, strings of fish, pieces of meat, wool shearings from the country of origin, stalks of flax, and strips of purple wool, according to Rabbi Meir.
So Rabbi Meir, this is his list, right? Of these things, you get to keep. Make sense? Everyone understand the different points on the list? Right, you find a couple coins scattered, there's a few apples, sort of spilled out on the sidewalk over here. You can keep them. You put them in your pocket, off you go. No problem.
Rabbi Judah says anything which has in it something unusual must be proclaimed.
So Rabbi Yehuda adds a little codicil, a caveat to that statement.
How is this so? If he found a fig cake with a potsherd in it, or a loaf with coins in it, he must proclaim them. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, new merchandise need not be proclaimed.
Okay, so we're going to come back to point C, right? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar in a second. But let's make sure we understand Rabbi Yehuda first. So Rabbi Yehuda is trying to help us narrow a little bit what Rabbi Meir said. So Rabbi Meir said if you find, an apple just sitting there on the sidewalk, you do not have to take the apple and walk all around town asking, does this apple belong to anyone? But instead you can pick it up and it now belongs to you. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, yeah, but if that apple has a address label on it, if that apple has a special carving on it that would make it look different than other apples, make it look distinctive, then you don't get to just keep it.
Even if it's just one apple.
Even if it's just an apple. Right? If you find a coin that's just sitting there, generally speaking, you get to keep it. If you find a coin with someone's address written on it, probably not. if you find a coin that's inside of one of those little numismatic collector's pockets that says, Battle of 1812 American silver dollar or something like that, well, that's not just a coin scattered. That's a coin with something rather unusual about it. And why would that make a difference?
Be more identifiable.
Because then you can identify it, right? Because then someone can come to you and say, oh, yes, it was in a little plastic sheath and it had a thing about a Battle of 12 on it, and it was da-da-da-da-da. Whereas if it was just a quarter, how can anyone tell you that it was their quarter? It's not my quarter. Well, it had an eagle on it. That's not identifying it, is it? Which brings us then to new merchandise. Why then would Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar say that new merchandise doesn't have to be proclaimed? You don't have to go around telling people, I found this brand new handbag?
Don't get that.
Well, use the principle that we were just discussing.
I am, but
Okay.
new merchandise can be described.
But it has no identifying marks on it.
So if you walk into so Malka, you walk into a department store and you buy a pocketbook, and Rhea goes in after you and she buys a pocketbook, and you're both walking out, and you both drop your pocketbooks, and one of them gets returned to the lost and found for some reason, because they didn't need to, but it gets the lost and found. How will you be able to tell which one was yours and which one was hers?
You mean if they're identical?
Because they're both brand new pocketbooks. You both bought identical ones because
But
you
they
both
don't
have good
say-
taste.
They don't say identical.
New merchandise. Okay, so there you go. So the new merchandise is assumed to be identical to other new merchandise. If you buy a hammer from Home Depot and I buy a hammer from Home Depot, until I start using it, until I end up wrapping the handle with black tape or putting this is where I dented it when I hit
So identical is, or common, is assumed here.
Exactly, and we're going to get to that more explicitly in our second paragraph. Marion, if you will.
And these must be proclaimed.
Right, these are things that if you find them, you have to talk about them.
If a man found fruit in a vessel or an empty vessel, or money in a bag or an empty bag, piles of fruit or piles of money, 3 coins one on top of the other, small sheaves in the private domain, homemade loaves of bread, wool shearings as they come from the craftsman's shop, jugs of wine or jugs of oil, these must be proclaimed.
All right, so all of these things, even though you might have 3 apples scattered on the sidewalk, if you have 3 apples that are in a bag, they have to actually be proclaimed. Why? Because the person can say there was a bag with 3 apples. And then by the number, you're able to identify that it's his. Or you can say, well, the bag was made of burlap, or the bag was plastic, or the bag was paper, or the bag said Publix on the side. And now there's something unique, identifiable, or distinctive so that it can be returned.
Is he obligated to do the due diligence to determine who it belongs to?
Hold on to that thought. Okay, but you're thinking in the right direction, because hopefully these juices are getting flowing in our brain and going, well, wait a minute, why am I off the hook of having to return it just because it would be impossible for someone else to identify it? I mean, shouldn't I just give it to the first person who comes up and says that it's theirs? I mean, I know they're not mine because I found them. I didn't buy these apples. I know they're not mine. So it may be impossible or almost impossible for someone to identify 3 random apples as being theirs, but that doesn't mean I should get to keep them. Surely I should just give them to the first person who says, hey, I lost apples. And the Mishnah is saying, no, you don't. And we're going to try and uncover why. The Mishnah hasn't said it yet, but we have to uncover why. What has happened that makes it so that that property can now be picked up and owned by you. And in fact, it's already ownerless when it's sitting there on the sidewalk. And that's what we're going to try and peel apart from all of this discussion till we get to our core principle. All right, onward.
If he found something in a shop, it belongs to him. But if he found it between the counter and the shopkeeper, it belongs to the shop.
All right, I think we turn the page. If you turn the page, you won't be looking at my artwork. Right, so You walk into the shop, right? Top-down view. And the shopkeeper has his counter and the stool. And you walk in here, and you find the 4 scattered coins right here. Who gets the coins?
You do.
You do. And if you find 4 coins over here because you were looking at something hanging on the wall, who gets those coins?
Shopkeeper.
All right, you learned your halakha, you got it great. Why?
I think what needs to be brought out, what is being sold in the shop.
Mm-hmm.
If fabric is being sold in the shop and you find fabric on the floor,
Mm-hmm.
it should belong to the shopkeeper.
Should it?
If it could have fallen off his shelf.
It could have, indeed. And what is happening here is the general principle the rabbis are trying to establish, which is there a way that we can make a reasonable and clear assumption of who the proper owner is of this item? These 2 locations give us an indication. If it's back here between the counter and the shopkeeper, then the presumption would be, I think it's a reasonable assumption, it's what the rabbis are arguing, that it probably is his, whether it be coins, whether it be fabric, whether it be fruit, or any of the things that could normally be kept by the finder. If you find it back in this zone, let's make a little zone marker, then it probably belongs to him because it's in his sphere of activity, his sphere of influence. But who's to say, whether it be coins, fabric, or fruit that is found over here, how do you know it doesn't belong to someone who purchased it from the shopkeeper? And they dropped it on their way out. The same way you dropped your pocketbook in my story. It doesn't belong to the department store anymore. It doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to the guy who just wandered off and dropped it by accident. So why should the shopkeeper get it just because it's in his domain? But it's not his.
Needs to move his closer to the door.
Exactly right. And indeed, you will find that in many of the open air type markets, right? You will have the counter here and, really no front. And people come up and they look at things and they ask the shopkeeper and the shopkeeper hands it to them and all the merchandise is behind because that makes it a lot safer from shoplifters. But it also means that anything that falls here is going to be in his pocket, not in yours. But if it's out here in the market way, if this was an open air market and this was the shuk, and right in front of his stall he sells, he sells fruit, but right over here you find 3 apples just sitting in the marketplace on the road. Do you pick them up and hand them back to the shopkeeper? No. You can keep them. Even if you might assume that there was a 20% chance that they might belong to him, the fact is there's not an overwhelming reason to believe they belong to him. And therefore, since they are unidentifiable, and since there is no strong suspicion that you can identify the owner by location, they belong to the finder. And you have not broken a mitzvah by keeping those bits of fruit. Make sense? Okay. Onward.
The garment was also included amongst all these things. Why was it mentioned separately?
All right, so pause for a second. I want to make sure we understand what we're talking about. If you go back to page 1115, that is to say verse 2, at the very end of the verse, and then also on verse 1116, verse 3, then you'll see that it says, if your ox or your sheep goes astray, don't do it, but you should give it back to him and wait for him to claim. And then verse 3, you shall do the same with his ass, his donkey. You shall do the same with his garment, and so too shall you do with anything that belongs to him, blah, blah, blah. And the rabbis are asking, very astutely, that's why we call them the Hachamim, the sages, why add the word garment? Right? We already said any of his livestock, and we're about to say anything that is his. Well, doesn't the phrase anything that is his include his clothes, his garments? So why single out garment in this verse? Remember, there's a general principle in Judaism that we don't believe the Torah wastes words. If the Torah says something, it wasn't just because God felt like it. It's trying to give us some bit of information. It's trying to teach us something that would have been lacking if that verse, that phrase, that word had not been there. So it's our job to figure out what was missing. And thankfully the Chachamim, thankfully the sages, tell us what would have been missing.
To compare and contrast, to teach you just as a garment is distinct in that it has special marks and it has those who claim it, so too everything that has special marks and those who claim it must be proclaimed.
Okay, so a garment, they're trying to say, is something that all of us can understand and all of us can recognize that it is unique, it's individual. Again, we're not talking about off-the-rack stuff from Target. We're talking about the garments of the ancient world, where every one would have been handmade, and every one of them probably would have been homespun, or if not homespun, at least you would have made a request from the tailor of exactly which fabric to use and which design it should be in, so that no two garments would ever look alike, and anyone who had worn the garment for more than a day would have already broken it in. It'd have, chafing in this place and a patch over here, and you would have stitched up this arm and you would have let out that leg or whatever it would have been. The garment is uniquely identifiable in the minds of the ancients because everyone would have known their clothes intimately. They didn't have wardrobes that were so big they didn't know what was in them. They were usually wearing the clothes that they would be sleeping in, that they'd be wearing tomorrow, that they'd be sleeping in, and so on and so forth. And their clothes would be their blanket. So clothes are uniquely identifiable and incontrovertibly identifiable, again, in the ancient world. So it doesn't quite register to us, but that's what they're trying to get at here. And therefore they're saying we can derive from having spelled out or singled out clothes that the Torah is trying to point to a general principle, which is anything that is unique or easily identifiable and distinguishable from one from the other, and that people are going to be looking for it. No one loses their blanket, the only blanket they have in life, and not going to be trying to find it, especially because they know what it looks like and they can tell you. Anything like that has to be, has to be returned and proclaimed. You have to go and tell people, I found a cloak, I found a dress, I found shoes. Make sense? Even if it's just plonked in the middle of the road.
Or it could have fallen off the wagon.
Exactly. It fell off the horse, it fell off the wagon, or while he was walking, or he hung it up on a tree while he was relaxing in the water and it blew away. There's any number of things that could have happened, but he's not going to give up on it. He's not going to just say, oh well, I lost my cloak. Because by nightfall, he's going to really, really wish he had his cloak. Or because else he's going to be really, really cold. And he knows that he'll be able to tell anyone who found it enough distinguishing features that they will be able to identify him as the rightful owner. Make sense? Okay. Onward.
For how long must a man proclaim? Until all of his neighbors know of it, according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Judah says, at the 3 pilgrimage festivals and for 7 days after the last festival, to allow him 3 days to go back to his house, 3 days to return, and 1 day on which to proclaim his loss.
Okay, so again, you got to know a little bit about the ancient world for this to work. And I apologize again to cartographers everywhere for my map of Israel. That's too wide. Need to have a little bit of narrower here. Israel in the ancient world looked roughly like this, or at least these were the areas where Jews mostly lived within the realm of Jerusalem. 3 times a year, there were Chagim, there were pilgrimage festivals, which were Sukkot, what's that? Shavuot, and Pesach, exactly. And that meant that 3 times a year, everyone was going to Jerusalem for the celebration and sacrifices and all that kind of good thing. And what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that Rabbi Meir's principle that just until your neighbors have found it isn't good enough. Because our obligation to return lost property is not just our obligation to our neighbors, it's our obligation to everyone. And the only way I can make sure that everyone knows about it is by going through a full year cycle of 3 of the festivals. And at every festival, I would say, I found a cloak. And then anyone who lost a cloak could come and talk to me. And then I could say, well, it's this, that, and the other. And what are we doing with these 3 days then? Why do we have 7 days tacked on to the end?
Travel.
What's that?
Travel.
Travel, exactly. So what you would have is, let's say you're here in Jerusalem. I think my pen's dying. You're here in Jerusalem, and you're proclaiming that you found a cloak. There we go. And someone says, you know what? Bob lost a cloak, and he wasn't able to come. Well, no part in Israel is more than 3 days from Jerusalem. It's one of the advantages of having a small geography, which means that I can run back to Bob, tell him about this. Bob can run back to to Jerusalem and say, yes, I lost a cloak. It was this wonderful, cloak. It had the Wiggles on it and all of that. You don't have kids. The Wiggles, the band. It had Winnie the Pooh on it. How's that? There we go. And then it can be returned to the rightful owner. So you go for a full year of proclaiming this. And if no one claims it, then it's yours. But why? Why should anything ever become yours? Remember I said that was sort of the principle we're sort of trying to ferret out from all of this. Just because no one can identify it, just because no one is going to be able to find it, why should that make it yours? It's still their property, right? If I drop my wedding ring in the middle of the Arizona desert, it's still my wedding ring, right? No matter whether it's been 1 year or 20 years or 1,000 years, it's still mine. Doesn't my property remain inviolably? Doesn't it remain incontrovertibly mine? The answer is no, but why not?
The statute of limitations of some sort.
The statutes of limitations, but Judaism doesn't like just saying it expires. It wants something to happen that changes the ownership. Or in this particular case, makes the ownership dissolve entirely so that the item, bless you, becomes ownerless.
Shemitah.
Not Shemitah. Okay, so we're gonna look at Sefer HaChinuch, which is one of the great compendiums from the Middle Ages, that goes through the different mitzvot, mitzvah by mitzvah, and doesn't give us all the details. You need Mishnah, Talmud, and Halacha for that, but gives us some nice summaries and, importantly, some good insights into what's going on. So, Marion?
The root reason for this precept is known because in this lies a useful benefit for all and harmony for the land. Since forgetfulness is common in all humans, moreover, all their domestic and other animals always run off hither and thither.
Hither and thither, exactly. So we pointed out that it's not surprising that God gave us this commandment of returning lost property, because this seems to be something that is very, very helpful for having a harmonious society. I mean, imagine, again, if most of your wealth was tied up in agricultural and land and animals, if your sheep kept getting loose and anyone who saw them could just take them. Imagine what that would do to the fabric of your community. It's like, I know that sheep's mine. Look, it's got the bell around it that I tied on it. Hey, man, I found it out in the field. Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. You're going to get a flat nose. That's not a happy way to have a community. And so it's being pointed out that we shouldn't be surprised that God gave us this commandment. It's not just a random edict. It is something that is teaching to an intrinsic character of human nature and our societies.
With this mitzvah, which exists among our people, animals and objects would be kept wherever they might be in our holy land, as though they were under the hand of the owners. All the commands of the Lord are right, gladdening the heart.
Right? Think about that phrase there for a moment, that no matter where your goat goes, it's still your goat. and you know it's going to come home. And it's going to be come home because the neighbor who's brought it back the last 8 times it got loose is going to bring it back the 9th time. Because it's a principle of our people that if I see someone else's goat, I don't think, woohoo, goat. I think I get to do a mitzvah by bringing this back to that person. That ownership is universally recognized among these items that are returned. Which leads us back to the same question. What about the stuff I don't have to return? What about the random bits of fruit? Shouldn't that also be returned as part of the gladdening of the hearts and of the working of a society?
As to the reason why a man gains possession of a found object that has no identifying characteristic, the sages of blessed memory said it is because its owner gives up hope for it. In other words, he withdraws his thought and his right of ownership from it, since he has no identifying feature in it. Alternatively, even if it has an identifying characteristic, if it fell in a place where the owner would give up hope for it in any event, for instance, marketplaces where most of them are either, the person who finds it is thus as one who gains possession of something ownerless.
So during the time of massive idolatry, there was not a lot of feeling that the idolaters were good about returning lost objects. And, at least within our own experience, generally speaking, Jews did not get things that were lost, and Jews usually didn't get things back that were even rightfully theirs, let alone lost. So they're trying to point out that this would have been a problem. But the underlying principle here is what's known in rabbinic terminology as yeush, to despair. That if you despair of recovering something, that it no longer is yours. Right? If you think, look, I lost a $100 bill somewhere in the shopping mall. It's gone. It's gone. You can kiss it goodbye. Now, you can say I can kiss it goodbye because there's no way that even someone who finds it and wants to return it to me will be able to know that I'm the right person who has it. Nobody knows the serial numbers of their money, right? So how would I prove to him it was my $100? And even if I sort of thought I could, it may be, and in America I think we got a little bit of a mixed record on this, but it may be that if I was living in a society where nobody returns anything, that I would also just imagine it's gone. I would despair of ever seeing it ever again. Now, Judaism does put a limit on that you don't get to figure out for yourself whether you think the owner should have given up on it or not. You can't say, oh, look, a beautiful diamond ring. I'm sure that they've already given up hope on this. Diamond rings are usually quite identifiable, and therefore you would have to still proclaim it and try to return it. But the underlying principle is that when a reasonable person would have despaired of ever seeing it again, then ownership is nullified. And that's why you get to keep it. Because you're not keeping something that belongs to someone else, you're keeping something that now belongs to no one. Make sense? Maybe?
Yes.
Okay. Again, the rabbis were very clear. They wanted to have a transformative step in that transfer of ownership. They didn't want people to think they could just take something that they found. They wanted them to have this thing that you could only take it if it's now ownerless. And the only reason why it would be ownerless, with all of these examples in place, is because the person knows there's no chance of ever seeing it again or being able to identify it, even if they did. Even if they saw that $100 bill a month later, and by someone paying for something, I wouldn't know it was mine. It would be no way for ever knowing it again. I want to bring that topic back in our just a couple minutes left to this. The land of Eretz Israel. Mm-hmm. Who owns it?
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Good. Who owns it?
We do.
We do.
They give it to us. Even if we leave, it still has to come back to us.
Even if we leave, it still has to come back to us. It's still our possession. We can identify it, and we know where it is. There was never any doubt of that, even though the vast majority of Jews for most of the last 2,000 years didn't live within its borders. Everyone knew where it was. And did we ever give up hope? Did we ever despair as a nation? Obviously, individuals aside, did we ever as a nation despair of returning to Israel someday? No. Always hope in our prayers every single day, multiple times a day, in our studies, in our thoughts, in the wishes that we gave to each other and the greetings that we had. Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. We constantly kept our mind on Israel. This whole phrase right here where they said, because the owner gives up hope for it, in other words, he withdraws his thought and his right of ownership from it. If we had withdrawn our mind from Israel, if we had given up hope of ever being restored to our land as had been promised, if we had taken our heart away from Israel, then yeah, we wouldn't really own it anymore. Any more than, someone in America whose great-great-great-grandfather came from England would really most likely not have a legitimate claim to some patch of farmland that his great-great-great-great cousin now owned. Because when he came here, he never intended to go back, and the people who lived here never intended to reclaim that land, and it was not part of daily and intimate life cycles to think about that patch of land. And yet, this has been. We have never performed Yeush. We have never performed an act of despairing of returning. And that's why it's still ours. God's promise notwithstanding. We could have messed it up. But for 2,000 years, against all reason, against all encouragement, we never took Israel from our hearts and from our minds. And we need to make sure that that continues for another 2,000 years. What's that?
We shouldn't give up anyway.
That's a much longer conversation. Ownership is ownership. And what we do with what we own is a very complicated process. But certainly our right to do with what we own should not be denied. But how we take care of the land and how we use the land for various goals, that's a much more complicated discussion. But that it is ours to make those decisions with is not. All right, take care, everyone. Let's see if the recording actually worked this time.